We're going to cross over now to another very fascinating panel that's going to be hosted by Aubrey Hubre, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And it's about the importance of investing in digital infrastructure to drive economic growth and recovery.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Aubrey Ruby, and I am a senior fellow at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. And it's my pleasure today to be hosting this conversation about investing in digital infrastructure to drive economic growth and recovery in African markets. I am honored to be joined by such a high-level panel working in this space. And this topic is especially critical given the challenges that COVID has presented to the region, where we have the first recession across African markets in 25 years. And so it's really incumbent on us to bring to bear all the best thinking, the best technology to drive economic growth. And one of the key and bright areas of this period is in digitization. And we're seeing increasing digitization across the continent. And really, in order to sustain that, scale it up, we need more infrastructure and digital infrastructure. So we're really talking about that today. And I first want to welcome to the panel Alan Ibobise, the CEO of Africa 50. Africa 50 is a fund that is investing across the region in infrastructure, but has a special focus on digital infrastructure. So Alan, tell us what you're working on these days.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Aubrey. And let me also say a warm welcome to all participants. I'd like to thank also the distinguished speakers who are joining us today for this important discussion. Look, ICT infrastructure has always been critical for our continent development, but the coronavirus pandemic has just made this more apparent and urgent. As an investment platform founded by 28 African countries and the African Development Bank, Africa 50's mandate is to mobilize public and private sector capital to help develop investment in bankable projects. We have long recognized the importance of digital infrastructure. So that's why ICT is one of our top targets in our investment strategy. Now, while Africa's most advanced countries, I should say, and cities have the necessary digital infrastructure, others, and especially remote rural areas, are deprived of connectivity and social economic resilience that this can provide. So bridging the digital infrastructure gap will require massive investments. The World Bank has estimated that $100 billion is needed over the next decade to achieve universal broadband internet access in Africa, with a third of it, that $100 billion in infrastructure. So it will be difficult given the strained finances of government. And also we have seen a high capital flight away from Africa, but there are ways that we can achieve that. And so we need to attract investment in ICT infrastructure. So how do we do that? This is actually one of the key questions, and this is what Africa 50 is trying to do. But government should continue to create a conducive regulatory framework. And also government should also be willing to share some of the risks that maybe the private sector would not want to take with DFI support. We believe that private sector participation, and that's a key message, it's very important in this digital infrastructure space.
Well, you brought up the important role of government there. And so we're so honored to be joined by Minister Paula Ingabire from Rwanda, who's the Minister of ICT and Innovation. And you know, Rwanda is known for really doing very innovative public-private partnerships. I think of Carnegie Mellon, I think of the Innovation City that's coming up. Tell us a little bit how you're looking at digital infrastructure. President Kagame has many times said that the future of Rwanda is around the people and the knowledge workers. And in order to do that, you need people connected. So, you know, how have you built the connectivity and inclusive digital access in Rwanda?
Thanks, Aubrey, and thanks for having me this morning, stroke afternoon, for this conversation, which is really timely. As you rightly said, I think a lot has been done in terms of the necessary environment that has been put in place to make sure we roll out the much needed digital infrastructure within Rwanda. But that said, I think even going forward, what we increasingly are seeing is the need to make some policy adjustments to respond to some of the existing gaps that we have. And just to pick on what you had just said, I think what has made it possible up until today is some of the progressive policies around how we can improve the quality of broadband infrastructure, but also most importantly, how we can scale this last mile connectivity. We see this through some of the infrastructure sharing policies that have been put in place for a couple of years now. And this has really contributed to how we can lower the cost of investment for many of our operators who are rolling out this kind of infrastructure, from the leasing of towers, but also at the same time, thinking about going forward, how do we lower the mobile termination rates? Interestingly, this week, there's been discussions around thinking about some of the roaming arrangements that need to be put in place for our operators, which will facilitate roaming site sharing. And all that really comes in to say, what is our role as government to ensure that we're lowering this cost of investment, but also enabling the private sector to be able to scale this infrastructure.
And are you partnering at all with innovative solutions? I've heard some countries looking at satellite for last mile. You have the Google Loon project with balloons.
Yes.
You know, how are you thinking about last mile infrastructure?
That's a very good question. I think even what we have currently in the pipeline is even a partnership with Japan, a Japanese company, Haps Mobile, which is really also looking, it's a similar concept to the Loon project. And what we want to do is how do we facilitate structure? But also beyond you know, such partnerships, what we also want to be able to see from a policy and regulatory perspective is thinking through what are some of those regulations that are not necessarily one-sided. I think it's natural for all governments to put in place first and foremost regulations that benefit consumers and our citizens, such as price regulations. But I think in the long term, this constrains the ability to scale and provide the last mile connectivity solutions that we're talking about. And so really thinking about how do we promote a healthy competition within the private sector that is going to drive investment as well as innovation. The other thing that we're thinking around to push for last mile is when you look at the scale of investments that are required for last mile connectivity, government alone cannot do it. Even the private sector won't be able to do it if there's no kind of partnership. And I think you did allude to the kind of progressive PPP frameworks that we've put in place. But I think what we need to be doing now, there's the concept of blended financing that we now are thinking about as a country to leverage, really thinking about what type of financing is available, whether it's from the development partners, from the government, but that how do we structure it in a way that is going to unlock private sector financing that can then massively scale this kind of infrastructure. But for blended financing to really work, I think we'll also, beyond looking at the structuring of it, it's also thinking about the availability of data. Because many of these private sector partners are going to need data, are going to need methods of really, you know, measuring impact. And so without that, I think it would be difficult to really bridge on this gap.
And many of them have the data, right? So, you know, the biggest data repositories in African markets are the telcos themselves. Yeah, so in many ways, they are the source of data. But I want to turn to Lucina, who's also joining us from Kigali today. And Smart Africa is a platform that kind of brings together all these players, including the telcos. Lucina, how are you seeing this challenge of last mile infrastructure?
You know, it's very quite interesting. We talk about the challenge of this last mile, but in order for us to really identify and decide what we really need to do to progress, it's very important and essential to understand where actually we came from as a continent. You know, I would like to recount just 3 of them. Among many. Firstly, you know, 6 out of 10 fastest growing economy are in Africa, in the world. 5 out of 10 reform in the world based on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index are also in Africa. Secondly, we are the global leader and the pace setter in the mobile finance services, as we know, through like MTN Mobile Money, M-Pesa, Vodafone.
Yeah, especially in East Africa. I don't think that experience is universal across the continent, though.
Exactly. Most importantly, thirdly, we are the fastest growing continent in terms of broadband penetration. We talked about last mile, but we are the fastest in terms of broadband penetration with a 45% compounded annual growth rate between 2015 and 2019. So notwithstanding the limited broadband penetration we have, we still expect fourfold increase in the total internet consumption from the current, which is 15 terabyte. I'm talking here under the control of Main One. They have this data from 15 terabyte to 74 terabyte by 2024, which is only 4 years down the road. So this is, you know, the story of Africa. And now, how do we move from where we are now? You know, according to the recent publication of GSMA, you probably all heard about that. Sub-Saharan Africa has about, very important, 25% of coverage gap. And 49%, which is about 520 million population, usage gap. And I will explain that. And only 26%, which is 270 million in Africa, are connected. What does that actually mean? We have area of 25% population not covered by infrastructure, last mile urban area, rural area, sorry. And we have 49% usage gap. It means infrastructure is there, but for some reasons, people are not connecting to the internet.
But most of the time people, I mean, this is a mobile first generation, right? The window to the world is the mobile. And we're talking, that is how access is going to reach most people.
Exactly. So taking that 49% users gap is a huge opportunity and it's a low-hanging fruit, which require our collective effort to resolve this issue. So the users gap affect both the demand and the supply side, which range from ensuring affordability of the internet services, affordable devices, creating relevant content as well, in empowering the population with digital skills. So with the Smart Africa, we have embarked on project that will address these issues. One, to increase the broadband affordability, we make the service affordable by aggregating our internet bandwidth purchase as a 30 country together, member country. We have just concluded a market intelligence information that shows a potential to solve the affordability issue by making the country save between 30 and 50% on the cost of the bulk purchase. If we work together as a country, if we purchase together, if we set our long-term goal together, because you see, it's just demand and supply. Number two, the smart device, we can make internet affordable. What about the smart devices? We are working on that to cater for the increased smartphone penetration in Africa, because some of those 49% area, people cannot afford smart devices. I think Minister Paul and I, we've been talking about that for a long time. Thirdly, the Startup Act and ICT ecosystem. This is to promote entrepreneurship, because remember, in the 49%, you could have connectivity. It could be affordable, but there's no content. So as long as we do not promote our entrepreneurs to allow our startup to shrink the gap of content development and contribute to a resilient social economic development with the innovation, because remember, the sustainability is driven by the innovation in time.
Well, I'm glad you brought up those 3 points, particularly content, entrepreneurship, because it brings us to Nigeria, really. You know, the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Nigeria is robust. It attracted a lot of investment last year of the venture capital world, and it also produces an incredible amount of content.
Absolutely.
But we have joined today by Funke Epeke, who's the CEO of Main One, who's been building, physically building this infrastructure in terms of broadband connectivity. And Funke, give us a picture of your view as a private sector operator in the space, the trends that you've seen over the last couple of years, and how you think of last mile connectivity.
Thanks, Aubrey. Delighted to be on the panel. And indeed, when we think of the opportunity we have on the continent for improving access to the internet, access to broadband services, and the need for digital infrastructure, I think over the past 10 years, the requirements or the opportunities have shifted from the first mile, which was a subsea, to the last mile. And what we're saying, COVID has only heightened the challenges or the gaps that we have in terms of connecting with our citizens, especially in the rural areas, and addressing issues of affordability. The reality is that in some areas where you have coverage, citizens do not have the affordability or the devices to effectively access those services. So where are we seeing the movement in terms of infrastructure? I would say more fiber. Fiber is still not going to be affordable to every household in Africa. We're still largely mobile, but we're seeing more fiber to the tower and some fiber to high net worth areas, to homes in high net worth areas, and also to businesses. So that is an innovation that is also enabling better broadband access, improved quality of access.
Is it a matching issue, Funke? Because I've always heard that, for example, in some cities, perhaps Lagos, one of them, that there's more capacity at the landing spot for the subsea cable that then is not terrestrial distributed. So you actually have a mismatch where some countries actually have a lot of capacity coming in, but is therefore not used because of the missing terrestrial fiber. Is that the case?
Absolutely. So you don't have the density of fiber to take it to the towers or the base stations. In the cities, not enough of them are connected. In the rural areas, hardly any of them are connected, and too many are still connected with microwave radio to back all that traffic, which limits the amount of capacity and broadband that can be delivered into those areas.
And what held back investment in fiber? I mean, what's the missing piece, or what's held it back? Because now the subsea cables, many of them arrived years and years ago.
Yes, so there are quite a few issues. Affordability and the need for high levels of investment is one. The infrastructure deployment model is another critical one, and I heard the Honorable Minister talk about that. When you look at income levels in Africa, per capita, and the cost of infrastructure, which is very similar globally. And in addition, a lot of our countries, government sees telecommunications as a cash cow. So they want to charge high fees for the deployment of infrastructure. So the input taxes to deploy are quite high. And then you don't have good models for shared infrastructure. It becomes very difficult or not viable for private operators, and most of our countries, telecommunications is deregulated, to make those investments because they're not able to generate a return. So models for shared infrastructure are really critical. And in countries where that has worked, you have been able to increase the fiber density, deployment of 4G, availability of spectrum to do that, sharing of the infrastructure, towers, fiber, spectrum, roaming. The Honorable Minister also mentioned roaming arrangements so that not all operators have to deploy their own proprietary infrastructure in rural areas. So some of these innovations are what's critical to drive improved access and actually make broadband services more available.
Yeah, and an open question to this group really, which is, how do we attract some new players in terms of new investors? Because, the telcos have been there a long time. We know the tower space is pretty consolidated with 3 or 4 major tower companies. How do we bring in new players, or is it about building on Main One and helping Main One grow into these spaces? It's probably an and question. But Alon, maybe you can jump in on attracting some of the new players and what kind of incentives they need.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Aubrey. And I think we need many Main Ones. Certainly, we need Main One to grow, and we are supporting that kind of, champions in Africa. But we also need to crowd in more actors that can actually provide financing. One of the ways that at Africa 50 we are trying to bring institutional investors to come into the digital infrastructure space is to basically to promote asset recycling of some of the digital infrastructure that have been built by some of the governments funding with public funding. And we are telling some of these government, our shareholders, and say, look, you don't necessarily need to own this network. Maybe you could concession out this network to a group of private investors that we would put together. And there are many benefits to this approach of asset recycling is, first of all, you can actually bring pension funds, insurance investors, because those assets are already generating revenues.
Yeah.
But then you can also provide additional funding to government, freed up capital that is immobilized in those assets. Government can use this capital to provide additional capital to facilitate blended financing to get to universal access, because everybody is saying that while those assets, ICT infrastructure can be attractive to the private sector cannot do it alone. There's still some spaces where you don't have enough commerciality actually to get the kind of returns that the private sector wants. So you need blended approach. That's what Minister Pola was mentioning, and then we support this kind of approach.
And speaking of that blended approach, Minister Annalan, feel free to jump in, but what are we talking about? Are we talking first loss guarantees, or what is it that the blended aspect will give the private sector? Is it some type of guaranteed return or monopoly? Again, how is blended finance being used? A lot of times people just throw around the term, oh, we'll just use blended finance.
Minister, you want to go first, or I can come after you?
Sure. Definitely first loss guarantees are something that is being looked into. I don't think a monopoly is the way to go. I mean, back to the same point we were discussing earlier about constraining competition. And so if you start to structure some of these blended financing models that encourage monopolies, then I think we lose out on the bit of how do we encourage competition and of course adoption across the board. So there are multiple things that we definitely, and principles that one needs to look at, especially even thinking about the local context, but also structuring these blended financing models around a development agenda, first and foremost, and then thinking about how do we, provide those first loss guarantees that really are going to incentivize the private sector to come in.
Yeah, I would add, I agree with what Minister Pola said. I would agree that, in the space of blended financing, what we are advocating at Africa 50 is creativity, that there is no one size fits all. Basically, of course, first loss is one of the options, but many people have used viability gap funding, or you could also use capital buy down, where basically you're saying, okay, we know that we want to finance this network infrastructure network of $200 million, but $200 million of capital will not provide enough return to private investors. So we'll buy down the capital and get private financing only maybe for half of that, or whatever the financial model will tell you. And I think that these are the kind of innovative ideas that we are trying to push. But I like to really emphasize the fact that, in some of the countries, you've seen government funding some of the infrastructure, and then the maintenance, the operation is not up to par. And we are proposing that, look, this is not necessarily what the government does the best. The government is better at establishing regulations, defining what they need to target in terms of goals. And then the private sector will come and run this and also invest and then maintain the assets to par. So we are trying to do this kind of transaction, at least in one of our shareholders' countries, and hopefully we can see those asset recycling transactions in many more countries. Aubrey, before I finish, I like to emphasize the fact that while we are talking about big size investments, which is fine, we need this, we also need to support innovative, smaller investment through venture capital approach to finance disruptive technologies, and more importantly, to create ecosystems that will allow entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs, African entrepreneurs to thrive. This is what we are trying to do with Kigali Innovation City, together with Minister Pola and her team and Rwanda Development Board in Rwanda, of course, under the great leadership of President Kagame. These are some of the things that we want to do, big project, but also smaller project. I think that would be a winning combination.
Of course, we have this reinforcing, right? The entrepreneurs need the digital infrastructure because so much of the entrepreneurship is built on digital on the backbone of the mobile revolution. And really, I want to encourage our audience to ask questions. We're taking them in the chat, and we're going to weave them in here. But I want to turn to Lucina and say, one of the challenges of the region is that there are so many small countries, right? And you're in part trying to pool the buying power of those small countries. And, you know, because it's different, and Nigeria is very different than a Burundi when it comes to digital infrastructure because of the landlocked nature of Burundi, the small size. So how is Smart Africa trying to balance and help the smaller markets?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, that is in fact, it is, you can see this as a challenge, but it's actually the beauty of the Smart Africa, actually. It's the reason why, because by working together, and we've seen this, Rwanda has done it before by a bulk purchase project that we're trying to put together. It was a success in Rwanda. As you can see today, the cost of the internet today in Rwanda is actually cheaper than even my home country, Ivory Coast, and that's the fact. But Rwanda is a landlocked country, but Cote d'Ivoire is not a landlocked country. We have a 4th submarine cable going through there. So by actually gathering ourselves as a bulk purchase project, which we actually approach the supplier, such as Main One and other just to list a few, to lock country in for a long term, for a bigger, and even for a landlocked country like a Burundi, like a Chad, like a Niger, because these countries still paying a lot of money for the internet, but it's only by working together, the cost, it will drag the cost down. Well, because the capacity on the cost of the Atlantic Ocean or the Indian Oceans, or I'm talking about the countries facing the Atlantic, it's not an issue at all. They have the capacity. But how come the internet costs sometimes cheaper, like in Rwanda, and than other countries, which like Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire and so on?
And you know, really, should we look to India? Look at the price of data in India over the last 6-7 years. I mean, with Reliance Jio, the price went dramatically down, and it unleashed millions onto a new like broadband revolution. I mean, mobile revolution, not broadband, but mobile data revolution. And it's all because of the cost of data.
Yeah, because also, you see, this is the right point, this is the right audience also to talk about. We all talk about the submarine cable around the continent. Look at the continent of Africa submarine cable. Have you ever talked about the intra-Africa connectivity? We have regional economic communities gathering to build highways from Abidjan to Nigeria, from Rwanda to Kenya, and highway investments. Why aren't we looking into the digital infrastructure that way?
But isn't the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and, you know, Wamkele Mene's commitment to digital trade a real part of this?
Yeah, exactly. But digital trade, Africa should not be connected only through the cost. What about the intra-Africa? Why countries are not connected one by one? And I think Ale and I, we talked about this a few months ago, which is the intra-Africa connectivity project, like a One Africa Network project as well. All of these projects, you know, they are important projects, sustainable project, resilient project, just like a road infrastructure from Nigeria to Ghana or whatsoever. We ought to be thinking like,
have some ideas, I'm sure about that.
I was just going to say, I mean, we are starting to see, and you're absolutely right, the bottlenecks today are not on the submarine cable, they are terrestrial. And we worked on a project earlier this year where we connected Burkina Faso, courtesy of our landing in Cote d'Ivoire last year, and working with a consortium of local operators to get capacity both from Ghana upcountry through some networks that had been deployed to the border, as well as through Cote d'Ivoire into Burkina. It was supported by the World Bank, and we brought together a consortium of internet service providers and operators to have that bulk capacity. And you're starting to see some of those country-to-country connections, the internet exchanges open up. There's still not enough of it, but that's where the work needs to be done. I also want to touch on the issue you mentioned of viability gap funding, because we see a lot of these assets, some that government had invested in and that are not properly utilized, which if leveraged by the private sector, either through concession agreements or joint ownership, but really opening up these networks, they will, one, allow private sector to bring more money as opposed to immediately putting money into government coffers. and actually drive more services. So they need to be governed with performance metrics that they have to achieve in terms of penetration or coverage. But I really think there's a lot of opportunity if public and private sector work together and we kind of step out of the box with traditional models and address the issues of affordability and the need for sharing and addressing those gaps, which are not just going to happen if we leave it purely to the private sector.
And Funke, I want to bring in a question from the audience. They comment about working with municipalities. I mean, Nigeria is a federal state, a messy federal democracy, similar to my home, the US. You know, how have you worked? What are the roles of local entities? We're talking about all these, the nation state, but of course you're dealing with states and municipalities and cities as well.
Absolutely, that is a particular challenge to Nigeria. And so we don't have a lot of those national backbones because the state governments have the right to control construction within the state and access to land and right of way. What we've seen post-COVID is a relaxation. We've had a lot of advocacy, I think, for more than 5 years at the National Executive Council level to standardize on rates and bring down right-of-way charges. Now, while the federal government has done that, what I say is federal roads don't get into the neighborhoods. Federal roads interconnect cities, and that's where more of the fiber deployment in Nigeria has taken place. But you're not getting to the towers and you're not getting to the homes and the businesses that need that access. And so what we're starting to see with COVID are a lot of the governors starting to relax those rates and adopt the lower rates being advocated by the federal government. What I expect we'll see over time are what we would call smart states or smart cities that would attract more investment because the cost of deployment is going down, and they are also advocating shared investment models. And hopefully that would bring others to the party. But it's still a checkered approach, not the most efficient for private sector that wants to build at scale and drive investment and returns and efficiency in terms of how networks are deployed. So it's growing out from the more viable high net worth areas, high net worth states where it's easy to attract investment to other parts of the country. Not going fast enough, but we are making progress.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the smart city question because, you know, Africa as a whole has the fastest urbanization rate in the world. It is quickly becoming an urban continent. And the city approach and creating innovation cities, you know, many multinationals now, they don't think about Nigeria as a market of 200 million. They think of Lagos, they think of Abuja, and they think of Port Harcourt, and then they go to Accra, then they go to Abidjan, because they don't think of it as a market entry for a whole country anymore. So really wanted to hit on this city. And, you know, Rwanda is home to the Kigali Innovation City project. So, Minister, are you able to tell us a little bit about what's the aim there?
Thanks again, Aubrey. I think just to start off on that, with the Kigali Innovation System, when it started off, we were looking at it as, you know, a geographic space where we were going to promote and nurture innovation. But I think that concept over the last 10 years has significantly evolved to the extent that we are no longer constraining the vision of the Innovation City, which in a few months from now will even change the naming because we feel it's very limiting when you focus on Kigali in naming it Kigali Innovation City. But the thinking around it is how do we put in place the right ecosystem from skills to infrastructure, to the much needed services, to the kind of financing that is required, because when you're talking about innovation ecosystem, then you need very specific innovative financing instruments for these innovators. And I think the fact that Africa has a very young population, you can imagine that makes the bulk of innovators on the continent. Now, these are the same people who in many ways will not have friends or family or people who are going to really even give them that seed capital that is really required. They don't even have any collateral to put to a bank. So financing becomes a key aspect. But I wanted to tie it into what you earlier said, just using examples so it's more practical. For us, really promoting innovations was starting with, let's think about services. How do we digitize services? We've been talking about digital infrastructure. In itself, it's not an end because you have the infrastructure, but how do you drive adoption and using this infrastructure? And so services, applications come in first. And so For Rwanda, it meant even creating those partnerships, for example, between Singapore and Rwanda to build, a platform through which all government services can be accessed, but then also progressively moving away from dependence on Singapore and building a team of local experts that were able to build a much more, better platform than we had 4 years ago when we started this partnership. And then moving on, the other aspect we look at is skills, and you can look at skills in different ways. There's digital literacy that is required because consumers need to have the capacity to be able to consume the services that you're giving them in a digital form. But there's also the high-end aspect, level of skills, which is really, you did allude to the Government of Rwanda partnership with Carnegie Mellon University. It was really structured to provide the much needed skills that were required to spur the necessary innovation that
people can become the creators of the digital economy. They're not just the consumers, they're creators of the digital economy.
Exactly. And then two last things I want to touch on is when you think about, Lassina did talk about devices. We've been thinking through about how do we make devices more affordable for the average African household. And so part of it is even looking at what partnerships do we bring. Today, we've structured arrangements with Positivo, with Mara, who have brought their factories here, allowing for homegrown, made in Rwanda products that can be competitive on the market, but at the same time, give us the ability to build skills for all these after sales and adjacent industries that we're trying to create. Yeah, and so these are a
lot of innovation in the space of device financing. Honestly, I believe that the market has driven prices down dramatically in techno phones, and some of the Chinese players have, they're not made on the continent, but nor is an iPhone made in the US. And, they brought down costs very, very dramatically in the last few years, but people need financing because they can't pay so much at the beginning. We're running out of time, and this conversation is so robust. I wish we could talk for another hour, but I wanted to go around and just to quickly say, like, these times have been trying. 2020 has been a hectic year for everyone. The COVID crisis has been a real drain on economic growth, activity, travel. So I really want to hear giving everyone a sense of optimism. What innovation are you seeing, and what are you optimistic about? We'll start with you, Lassina.
Wow. Well, I think COVID, this is, as they say, the new normal. I think it's an opportunity. It's an unfortunate opportunity for us, all of us, operating this ecosystem. It's been, decades ago. So to be adopted, I truly believe we are never going to go back to where we were before, because today, if you can see how many conferences, last time I met Alan was back in Yokohama. It was last year, but I've seen him this year through the video about 3, 4, 5 times. So this is actually good for us. I think it's an opportunity also for all our government, like I'm talking about Smart Africa country members, the government to take the digital infrastructure should be an essential services now. It is not like, it's not an option anymore. Just think about it. How many students today you have sitting at home today not going to school because they don't have access?
Data is becoming a human right. I mean, you're literally for your health, how you see your doctor, for your education, for work, we're all needed for that. So I couldn't agree more. Digitization, it's a digitization imperative that's coming out of 2020.
And it all is going to rely on the organization like Africa 50 to unlock the money for the investments in Africa.
Yeah, it's always about the money.
We have some, but not enough. Not enough.
What's really making you optimistic during these times?
Shared infrastructure, fiber densification, interconnection of our countries, so you don't have to go to Europe before you get traffic between neighboring countries.
Yeah. And I wanted to end with the Minister and Alon. We started with you. So Honorable Minister, really what innovations are you seeing that are inspiring?
I'll say two, and back to the aspect of data, looking at some driven applications in the healthcare industry as well as education. I think these have been the most disrupted, especially with the pandemic, but then also they give the most hope in terms of if we're thinking about meaningful connectivity, but also thinking about creating impact to the very last person on the continent. So edutech solutions and digital healthcare solutions that are data driven.
Yeah, education, it couldn't have come faster. I mean, there are 1 million Africans who turn 18 every month. You know, so how are they being educated? How are they being upskilled? And was education delivering the right employable skills? You know, maybe not. So these new platforms can really connect those dots. Alon, we will give you the last word.
Well, thank you. I think what excites me is the innovation challenge that we've launched. And we launched a global competition to try to find solutions to help address last mile connectivity in Africa. And you know what? Almost 80% of the solutions that we received, the proposal, came from right here in Africa. That shows that this continent is very vibrant in terms of innovation. And indeed, we selected the winners, and within an hour or so, or less than an hour, I'm told, we'll be announcing the winners. And with Minister Paula, we have agreed that we will implement the pilot that the winning proposal has proposed in Rwanda. And if it works in Rwanda, we believe it will work. We can scale it up in Africa. So this is very exciting. Lots of things happening in Africa. And also, I would like to say that the regional infrastructure, digital infrastructure, we are fully behind it with Latina. We're going to do some work on that.
Thank you, Alon. And really for our listeners, viewers, in about 30 minutes, Africa 50 will do the unveil the winners of this innovation challenge that Alon just mentioned. So you can tune in. You have to search the Africa Tech Festival platform to find the Africa 50 innovation track, but you'll be able to see real time who wins. So very exciting. I want to thank my guests today, my panels. It's been really fantastic and an important conversation that needs to be continued. So thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.